So, there was this pretty fiery interview with politician Barnaby Joyce, and it's really sent a shockwave through the Australian political conversation. In this explainer, we're going to unpack his diagnosis of the current climate, his really stark warnings, and what he sees as this massive disconnect between what's happening in Canberra and what's happening at your kitchen table.
And yeah, he did not mince words. This was his message, loud and clear, to the major political parties, a threat of political oblivion. Now that's a powerful opening shot, but Joyce claims it's not just talk. He's arguing it reflects a really deep and growing frustration among voters, and he believes he's got the numbers to prove it.
So what's he basing this on? Well, he points to this new poll that shows his party, One Nation, is now tied with the governing Labour Party. Both are sitting at 27%. For him, this is a huge signal that a political realignment is happening right under our noses.
So what's really driving the shift? Well, according to Joyce, it's basically a tale of two Australias. He's drawing a line in the sand, arguing there's this massive chasm between what the political class is focused on and what everyday people are actually worried about.
And this slide, well, it lays out his whole argument perfectly. On one side, you have what he calls the ideological stuff, big picture things like the Paris Agreement and cooling the planet. On the other side, you have what he says is the people's reality, the stuff that's hitting you right now, like the cost of living, crazy electricity prices, and whether we have enough fuel.
And he gets even more blunt with this quote. He paints this picture of the major parties just catering to what he calls the Great Gatsby crowd and inner suburban intellectuals. The message is pretty clear, right? He's saying a huge chunk of the population feels like they're being completely ignored, and that's the disconnect he's going after.
Okay, so let's dig into the first big area where Joyce says this disconnect is having some really dangerous consequences, and that's our national energy and fuel security.
He breaks it down into three key failures. First, he says we're way too reliant on power sources that aren't always on. Intermittent power, like wind and solar. Second, the country failed to rebuild its own oil refineries, which leaves us totally dependent on imports. And third, he claims that environmental rules are actually stopping Australia from getting to its own oil reserves.
And all of this, he says, leads to a pretty startling number. Right now, Australia apparently has just 24 days of fuel reserves. Think about that for a second. That's less than a month's worth of fuel to power everything from trucks and tractors to ambulances and the vans that deliver groceries. And just to put that number in perspective, the internationally required minimum is 90 days. So we're talking about a massive, massive shortfall here. And Joyce's point is that this leaves the whole country incredibly vulnerable to any kind of global disruption. It's a risk he believes is being ignored for other priorities.
And this whole issue with fuel and energy doesn't just stop there. It leads directly into his second major battleground, food security. Joyce argues that these same policies are now directly threatening our ability to feed ourselves.
You can really hear the frustration in his voice here. He's making a direct link between potential food shortages and what he calls the insane rubbish of prioritizing climate goals over practical needs. For him, policies that affect our resources have an immediate, real-world effect on the food supply chain.
And here's how he lays out that domino effect. It all starts with urea, a key ingredient for fertilizer. If you don't have that, you get lower crop yields. Simple as that. And what does that mean? Less flour, less starch, less of the basic stuff we use to make so much of our food. And the very last domino to fall? Well, that's what you see or don't see on the supermarket shelves. And we're not talking about a small impact here. Joyce uses wheat as a perfect example. With the right fertilizer, a farmer might get around 24 bags per acre. But without it, you're looking at maybe 3 or 4 bags. I mean, that's not just a little dip, that's a complete collapse in production. And he argues the consequences would be absolutely massive.
Okay, so after pointing out all these problems, you're probably asking, well, what's the solution then? Joyce doesn't just criticize, he also lays out a really specific policy alternative for how the country should be getting its share from our huge natural gas resources, and it's not about adding new taxes.
So this slide breaks down the two different ways of looking at this. On one side, you've got a proposal for a pretty straightforward 25% tax on gas exports. But on the other side, you have One Nation's idea, which is totally different. Instead of a tax, the government would actually take a piece of the pie, an equity share, and become a business partner in these projects.
So why do they think this is a better idea? Well, Joyce's argument is that if the government owns a share, its success is tied directly to the company's success. Everyone wins together. He also claims that this is much less likely to scare away big investors than just slapping on a new tax would be. So it's framed as a business partnership, not just a tax grab.
And that really brings us full circle, right back to the central theme of this whole thing.
Joyce is making a huge bet here. He's betting that when your own household budget is getting squeezed, the politics of what's real right now is always going to be more powerful than the politics of what might be. In a time when everyone's feeling the pinch, it's a really powerful argument. The big question is, who are people going to listen to?